I think my job today is to provide some perspective, to step pretty far back and say, why are companies feeling increasing pressure to manage their environmental and social issues for profit and advantage? What's happening in the world? What are the really big changes that are changing the way we eat, we live, we get around, and really affecting your industries in a pretty profound way? Let me start with just a little bit of kind of history on thinking about sustainability. And I promise there won't be a lot of like two by two matrices. I was a strategy consultant in my old life, so it's kind of the way I think. But in my first book, which came out about 15 years ago, we laid out a very simple model to say that companies create value in four fundamental ways. They reduce cost or risk, or they build the upside. They're trying to sell more stuff, or they're building intangible value, the brand value that comes from employee loyalty, customer loyalty, and many other things, and is now 80 to 90% of the market cap of the world's largest companies. Intangible is where most of the value is. And the logic here is that seeing your business through a sustainability, or at the time I wrote mainly about an environmental lens, can create value in all these ways. And that I could give you examples of large, from industrial to consumer facing companies that have saved literally billions of dollars through energy efficiency, water efficiency, waste. Companies that have been managing their environmental risk, in particular food companies, looking at their supply chain and climate change. Companies that have destroyed value through not managing environmental risk very well. A range of companies that have put numbers on the value, in particular, of employee loyalty, of the lack and reduction in turnover that comes from being a more sustainable company, of getting their people involved in mission and purpose. And then finally, kind of the top line, which everybody loves, which is how much stuff can we sell using an environmental discussion? So products that are, kind of pure plays like Tesla, or companies like IKEA and BASF that have looked at their portfolio and tried to make them more and more sustainable as they go. This is, in some sense, an old-fashioned view. If I had given this talk 10 plus years ago, I would spend most of it on this and give you these examples. But in a way, this is now kind of a given for where we are. Almost every large company in the world, pretty much all of them, have a sustainability report. They have a program. They get you can save money. We kind of have the basics. So there's been a deeper change going on. And I think in the last 2 years, we've seen more change in what it means to be a business in society than we've seen in the previous 20 that I've been in this business. So around 2 years ago, there was a kind of public statement from the Business Roundtable, and it's a lobbying group of the CEOs of the 180 largest companies in the US. And they got together and said, as a group, that they had been following kind of the traditional method of thinking about business for decades, and that the purpose was to serve shareholders, short-term shareholder profits. That was it. They said, that doesn't actually reflect what we do. We are serving stakeholders. And so this discussion of stakeholder versus shareholder capitalism really took off more when this statement came out. Now, a lot of these companies maybe haven't changed that much since then. They're not promoting the kinds of policies we need to make this change. But rhetoric matters. The way we speak about these things matters. And this started to kick off a new way of talking. And it wasn't now coming from Greenpeace, it was coming from CEOs or the Financial Times as they launched a site about capitalism. We were hearing that investors in surveys were saying that maximizing shareholder returns is not the only purpose. And you're now seeing the world's largest investor, Larry Fink from BlackRock, with $9 trillion or so under management. He's been writing a letter to the world CEOs every year, every January, and talking about ESG, or environmental, social, and governance issues, every year. And this year, he said very, very bluntly that climate change was the big important topic that we needed to address, and that the world was heading to a net zero economy, zero carbon, and that everyone would be impacted. So the conversation broadened. And then, of course, the pandemic hit. And we could talk a lot about what did we learn in the pandemic, and there was a lot. But I will say that companies were facing more pressure than ever to treat the world in a certain way, to treat their employees well, to see how they could help. And most stepped up. There were mistakes, but most stepped up. So, for example, Medtronic, the manufacturer of medical devices, put out its patent. It's the design for one of its ventilators, so companies like Ford and Tesla could go make some because we were short. And so To me, what's happened over the last couple years, and especially with the pandemic and with the racial and gender awakening, where companies feel the need to address some of these big social challenges, that sustainability has broadened to mean much more than just saving money or reducing risk, but it's about the role of business in society in a really deep way. And that what that gets at is the question of who are you as a business and even as a leader? What do you care about? What's your purpose? And who do you really serve? Right? Is it in the end, your customers and your employees and communities, or is it just shareholders? So we're in a time now of a great acceleration, an unbelievable acceleration and pressure building on companies. There's an acronym many use, the VUCA, which is that it's a volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous world, which means we don't know what's going to happen. But I'd also add that we're in an exponential world, that for decades we've had an exponential growth in, say, population or emissions of carbon. And there's good exponential trends and bad exponential trends, but it's creating enormous problems. And we face three grand, really existential challenges for humanity. One is inequality. And our system, capitalism, has brought billions of people out of poverty. It's provided well-being, but it's also now drawn pretty much all wealth gains into a small group of people. There were always gaps in wealth, but in the last 40 years, all of the income and wealth gains went to basically 1%. And that is different, right? There used to be kind of shared prosperity. As everyone got richer, everyone got richer. But now it's just a small group. And the income inequality is reflected and tied to gender and racial inequality. So, for example, in the US, a Hispanic woman makes 58% of what a white man makes. I don't think this can last, right? I think this is a pressure on society that will keep building. Second, we have climate change, which is really the fundamental challenge that we have to solve. I talk about it as the final exam for humanity. The Secretary General of the UN, on the latest science that came out in the last few months, said this is code red for humanity. The science is bad. It's very serious. It's moving very quickly. It's not a model anymore to debate. It's here now. And third, there's just the destruction, frankly, of a system that we are part of. We are a species, we are an animal, and we are part of biodiversity. And we're seeing this incredible loss, partly from climate change, partly from our use of land. And the horizon we're shooting for is moving away from us. The problems are getting bigger, faster, even though we're moving. We're not moving fast enough. And we've hit this tipping point where the cost of doing nothing is far greater than the cost of action for many reasons. But there's been this kind of false story that tackling climate change will destroy the economy. It's really the opposite now. If we do nothing, we will see vast trillion-dollar expenses around the world. So there are opportunities here. If I just left it at the pressures, it would be kind of depressing. But we're seeing also exponential change in the clean economy, this explosion of technologies and cheaper costs of bringing new technologies to bear. So companies buying renewable energy, that volume is growing exponentially, something like 23 gigawatts in 2020 during the pandemic. And that's not utilities. This is companies buying renewable energy directly. That's like 23 nuclear plants. It's a really big number. And the reason is very simple. It's not because of ESG or really a sustainability program, although that helps companies focus on it. It's that the cost of building wind and solar, according to the bank Lazard, that does this analysis every year, has dropped 70 to 90% over the last 11, 12 years. So it's just fundamentally cheaper in almost every part of the world now to build renewable energy. So the vast majority, 90% of all the new capacity put on the grid in the last few years has been renewable. So the battle's actually over, right? We're moving very quickly into a clean tech world, and it's happening also in transportation. So the cars are moving to electric drivetrains, so they will plug into this greener and greener grid, which is a great thing for all of us. It's a double whammy. So I don't think most people realize that all the major auto companies have now committed to move away from internal combustion engines. And Daimler very specifically said they're no longer investing in R&D in combustion engines. Well, that's really the end, right? And they said that a couple of years ago, and then they said this year we should actually speed that up. We got to move even faster. And you've seen this list of commitments from auto companies, from the delivery companies that they're going to zero emission vehicles by 2030, from countries like the UK saying we have to decarbonize transportation by 2050. We're at this tipping point. There's arguably, I think we've now reached peak fossil fuel, and in emerging markets and in all of the world. We're kind of at this peak place. And one of the most amazing transitions I've seen is that Ford, which makes the best selling vehicle really in the world for decades, has been the Ford F-150 series truck. It's a truck. They're coming out in early 2022 with the EV version, and they're leaning in. They're expecting this to be the business. So the opportunities here now from this transition, it's scary, right? I mean, transitions mean there's parts of the world and parts of the business community that are creatively destroyed, right? We're moving away from certain technologies, but there are multi-trillion dollar opportunities now in the energy system, in transportation, in manufacturing, in agriculture and consumer products, everything. These are all giant markets that are shifting very fast. And the pressure continues to build, not just from these economic reasons, but the pressure on companies coming from their core stakeholders and through these kind of mega trends is building. And I think one of the most powerful things that we're seeing is this desire for transparency, this need that people have as consumers to know what's in everything. You see this in particular in consumer products and in personal care, but it's rippling through, really every business where people want to know what's in everything. They want to know, where did this come from? Who made it? Were they paid a living wage? What's the footprint of it? What's the water impact? And that's true for buildings. That's true for entire value chains. More and more people want to know what's in it. And younger generations in particular, according to a McKinsey report, they don't really distinguish between a brand and its partners and suppliers. So even though I think most of your businesses are further back in the chain, they're B2B, it's part of this larger story for products and companies to tell about their entire value chain. And increasingly, people hold companies to a standard across all of their partners. And this transparency is now being driven as well by the regulatory and financial community, as you're seeing this increase in a bunch of different acronyms for reporting standards, for those things behind the scenes that nobody really thinks about, that set the standards for how we report financially and what we have to report on. And there's increasing pressure to report the materiality of especially climate, but all sustainability issues. And so I mentioned the younger generations in particular, they are changing things. This group of millennials who are now approaching 40, around that, so they're not kids anymore, but they're now about half of the global workforce. They have already, as a group that's been in the workforce 10 to 15 years, they've already said, 2/3 of them, they won't take a job or have not taken a job because of values. And Gen Z is even clearer. The vast majority say that a company has an obligation to do more than just make money. It has to solve environmental and social problems while doing it. We're seeing this pressure building, I think, increasingly business to business. And there's, I think, innovation going on and really sophistication in the pressure. There's always been questions about, increasingly what's your energy use, or, kind of basic questions. But now you've got companies like Salesforce in the US asking all their suppliers to look at this, what they call an exhibit, but it really looks and writes just like a contract. And they said, you have to hit certain climate standards. We need you to follow basically science-based targets on how fast to reduce carbon. And if you don't meet this standard, we will actually charge you a fee, a climate fee. So we won't pay you as much for your services. So that's really the stick, right? The kind of pressure. There's also the carrot, the companies encouraging better behavior. So the big retailer Tesco and the bank Santander have worked together now to provide Tesco suppliers with financing and better terms for financing to improve their business and invest in their business if they're hitting climate and ESG targets. So the ones that are performing better for Tesco will get better financing terms. And I think you're seeing more and more companies just go flat out to, if you want our business, this is what you have to do. So Porsche is saying you have to be using renewable energy. I think for the business to business world, it's always a competitive world. It's always kind of a commodity world, right? You're always competing on price and these sometimes very narrow distinctions. But I think this focus on sustainability and helping customers tell a better story is a way to break the tie. If it's between you and another business, this might be the tiebreaker. And I think for an increasing number of buyers, like Salesforce, like Porsche, it's a deal breaker, meaning you are not part of the decision set if you don't meet certain standards. So this is really about differentiating your business, and how will you do that? What's happening increasingly with transparency and the need to talk to younger consumers is the need to tell this story. Transparency is part of it, but a story about what you stand for as a business, what your products do, what your purpose is. And again, everyone back in the supply chain is now part of that story. It's open, the data's there, the technology is driving more transparency. So think about how you help your customers tell a story, help the win business, or help companies be more, safer and treat their people better. This is the story you can help tell, obviously. So what does this all mean? The pressures are building. The problems we face are enormous. It's kind of clear now that we have to go much faster. The business world is moving, but as I said, the problems are getting bigger very quickly. It's not enough anymore to just say we'll cut emissions, we'll be less bad. It's time to really step up. Business has to step up and help lead with civil society, with governments. It's not any one part of society. These are very big, sprawling problems. And so it was the need to try to accelerate that drove me to write this book um, over the last couple years with Paul Pullman, who was the CEO of Unilever. And Unilever is a consumer products company. Obviously, they sell huge, well-known brands. They're about 50 billion euros in revenues, but they're also a manufacturer. They make most of their stuff, so they have like the full kind of array of issues. And we're defining a net positive company as one that profits and grows from solving the world's problems, not creating them, from creating improved well-being for everybody that they touch in any way, all of their employees, their consumers, their customers, their communities, and on and on. And really at every scale, every product, every service, every factory, every country they operate in. And this is the North Star. This is the goal. It's not easy. Nobody's there yet. Unilever's not there yet. But this is kind of where we need to go. And the fundamental question we ask in this book is the world better off because your company is in it? Is it better off? And the companies that can answer yes will be more and more competitive. And the ones that can't will probably be relegated to the dustbin of history and will not be relevant anymore, may not survive. And we focus on a few key elements of this story. The core principles, kind of at the beginning of the book, that we think differentiate what makes for a net positive company are at core ownership, meaning taking responsibility for how the business impacts the world in broader and broader ways, even smaller businesses. There's always an impact, even if it's on a local community instead of the global community. There's always some set of impacts that go beyond just making the product. It's also about taking a long-term view and fighting the pressure for short-term returns, which has served its purpose. We've gone decades of shareholder returns only, but it's really starting to destroy rather than create. We need to be creating lots of kinds of value over the long term, and that means serving all these stakeholders. And shareholders come after that. It doesn't mean they don't do well. We believe they do very well. And Unilever, in a decade of kind of trying to go down this path, saw great returns, 300% total shareholder return in the decade that Paul was the CEO. So the shareholders benefit because you solve problems and do this right. And then, because the problems are big enough, you have to embrace a really deep form of partnering and collaboration that we're not really trained for and we're not always used to. So let me, I found it really interesting that I saw a really kind of smart, well-known businessman saying, "We choose the long-term view." So who was that? Well, that was your founder, right? This is in your description of the business, and its focus is that you take a long-term view. So let me talk about this ownership idea. And we have this model that's kind of nested circles, nothing too fancy, that companies have been looking increasingly at what's called the greenhouse gas protocol, at just on carbon, kind of three levels of emissions: the direct emissions from boilers, things on site, the emissions that come from the electricity you produce, and the emissions that come from the extended value chain, which is usually for most businesses far bigger than their own. But there's a number of people who have been kind of pushing this idea, and we kind of picked up some ideas and ran with it, that there's bigger levels, that in addition to what's in your kind of value chain, there's really the whole sector and how much the sector needs to change potentially into circular or regenerative business models that reuse every material, that really drastically change the energy footprint. There's a level of policy, and this applies, obviously more to multinationals and their influence in Washington, D.C. or Brussels. But everybody, every company has policy impacts or impacts on the local governments, even in towns and cities. I see this in my own community. So, are you, as the body, supporting the kinds of policies that help reduce emissions, right? And then at the largest level, say you're a consumer-based company, how are you contributing to consumption, as a global phenomenon that drives so much resource use? And how much are you contributing to a continued fossil fuel-based society? So you can do this kind of thinking about your impacts across a number of dimensions. So imagine you're doing it on employees and kind of the social side around really a safety-based business, like many of you are. So you might, start with obviously employee safety, zero fatalities, zero injuries, and then extend to, as most companies do, well, how are employees doing, especially in this hard kind of emotional time. But the larger view is, okay, what about our suppliers or our customers? What's their well-being like as people? Do we contribute to that? What about the communities around the business, around our business, around the supplier's business? How much are those people thriving? And again, the policies. So if you're in the safety and health business, how much are you and your sector and your trade associations pushing for the kinds of policies that encourage community safety and health, a culture of safety and health, and build that culture at the societal level? So even global health and well-being. And you might say, hey, I'm a small or mid-sized company. What do I have to say about global health? But I wanted to share with you the story of a company called Clark that's based in the Midwest in the U.S. And I met them a number of years ago, and the family run, the grandson of the founder, Lyle Clark, kind of woke up one day and said, we make pesticides. They kill mosquitoes. They help keep lots of communities in the U.S. livable. Right? There's places where mosquitoes would take over, like in Florida, and they said, we're using these pesticides. We're putting them out in the environment. They're actually, making the environment less healthy. And so they went down this path to say, why don't we make our business more sustainable? They saved, $500,000 a year just in kind of finding savings, and they're not a huge business. The employee turnover went down, so it goes back to that grid at the beginning. They improved their intangible value, and they developed a natural-based, non-toxic killer that got one of the U.S. Presidential Green Chemistry Awards, which normally goes to much larger companies. And when I ran into Lyle a few years ago now, their new statement or mission is, we're a global health company. It used to be, well, we kill some mosquitoes. Even at a small scale, they can say, this is what we help do. We help communities be healthy. So how do you build this kind of business, a net positive business? And I'll touch on some things pretty quickly. You start with purpose. That's the core about individual purpose. Where do you come from, and where does your business come from? And you guys have a very clear stated purpose to grow a safer, cleaner, healthier future for everyone every day. But there were a couple elements around that I saw in your materials around your DNA and your values that also struck me, where you said we have to commit to live the purpose, right? It's not enough to say it. And then there was one that just said, just be a good person. And that sounds like, so soft, and why is that in business? But that's really, frankly, kind of the undercurrent of all of this. Are we being a good person? Are we being a good neighbor? Are we being a good ancestor? Because why should a business not be a good person, right? Businesses are basically people in the eyes of the law, right? They have personhood. They can donate to whatever they want to on campaigns. So if they have the rights of a person, they should have the responsibilities, and they should be treating people well. I think there's just the need at all scales to have some easy wins, so you can demonstrate that there's some money in all this. Do some of the easy stuff. And companies at all sizes have done things like treasure hunts, where they ask their employees to go find energy savings. GE has done this for years. They've done it with smaller companies. They've found hundreds of millions of dollars. They've helped smaller companies find hundreds of thousands. And large companies have found repeatedly that they get a better return on investment on carbon and energy reductions than other investments. We need to ask new questions and innovate in a new way. And one of my favorite stories I've used for years is UPS. And they're not the only one that does this. Every kind of delivery company now has this process. But they started a number of years ago using GPS software and what's called telematics to map out routes so they didn't have to take left turns in kind of grids in cities that are grids. Because if you're waiting to take a left turn, you're idling, you're wasting time and energy and money. And so they realized that they could just route things to the right. And they saved, and this was numbers from a few years ago now, they saved a lot of miles and kilometers and a ton of gas. And this is efficiency. It is eco-efficiency and cost savings. But to me, it's a deeper kind of heretical, challenging question. What if we don't take left turns? That sounds really kind of crazy, but that's the kind of question we should ask. Next, I think it's about setting really big goals. And there's the global goals or the sustainable development goals that companies all over the world now are using as a guidepost. It's a kind of business plan for the world of what it would look like to have a thriving world. No hunger, gender equality, people have jobs, we've tackled climate change, and on and on. And now, basically, every large company has goals like these. Over 2,000 have science-based goals on carbon, meaning they want to cut at the pace that science says we need to. Dozens and more literally every day of very large companies have net zero. They're going to get to zero carbon. We're seeing targets of all kinds now. So in the supply chain and across the value chain, companies of lots of different sectors have said they want to get to a carbon neutral place for their whole value chain. Or someone like Target has said their suppliers have to set their own science-based targets. So they're rippling and putting this pressure up the supply chain. The leading edge of these goals now is companies like Microsoft and Google that have committed to sequester or take carbon out of the air, equal to all the carbon they've emitted since they were founded, or like Google, to power themselves just with renewable energy on site by 2030, which requires a change, requires on-site batteries and changes to the grid. And they talk about this, that this drives innovation and the need for partnership. You have goals like Henkel's looking forward to their customer impact, saying we want to triple the value we create for the footprint of our services. Caring in Europe has a net positive biodiversity goal. They want to save more land than their business impacts. But this requires these deep partnerships. And this is kind of my final thought, that there are lots of different kinds of partnerships that we're going to need. Apple is working with large aluminum companies to develop, and they now have a new kind of aluminum that uses much, much less energy. It's basically zero carbon. It's cheaper, it's fat, it's more productive, and it's rippling into other industries as Audi now is using this aluminum for the wheels in one of their EVs. You have companies partnering with, really cool technologies in their supply chain, like Patagonia and Timberland, using this insulation that also requires far less heat. It's just a much more creative way of insulating. And Timberland has this boot that uses leather from regenerative agriculture farms, which means that the farms sequester carbon. They're actually good for the environment for those to exist. This is what innovation looks like on climate. This is how we get there. And a lot of this innovation comes from smaller companies. Those of you that are in the small mid-size, you can drive this innovation. And we're seeing these industry level partnerships, these big efforts across the biggest footprint industries to come together and find a low carbon path for the industry. Unilever, who I've gotten to know very well in this program, in this book, has one of the most successful NGO and community partnerships, which seems like traditional philanthropy, but they've been helping kids learn about hand washing and using Lifebuoy soap, one of their brands. They've reached 1 billion kids. They've saved millions of lives because there's easily transmittable diseases you can avoid. But it's helped their business innovate and grow. And Lifebuoy soap, they created one because kids don't focus a lot. So they created a soap that kills the germs in 10 seconds instead of 30, that changes color so that the kids know. And this has helped their business grow. This is value from values. This brand, Lifebuoy, was stagnant for 100 years. It's now growing at double digits for the last 10, which is incredibly fast for a soap. And it's one of the €1 billion brands at Unilever. So what this all adds up to, frankly, is that business cannot thrive. We cannot thrive in business unless people and planet are thriving as well. That this is what we need to think about. The scale we need to think about in business is, how do we move to a positive impact? How will we be net positive? How will you be net positive? I thank you for your time and attention. I'd love for you to check out the new book. It just came out in the last few weeks. And I'm happy to take some questions. I'm looking forward to hearing what you guys have to say and which parts of this story are challenging or you want some more information on. So thank you for having me.
So thank you so much, Andrew, for a really thought-provoking and compelling talk. My name is Ollie Arbour, for everyone watching, and I'm the Brand and Content Director for Halma. I'll be here for the next 2 days helping put your questions to Andrew and all the other speakers. So please do dive in and ask as many questions as you can. So let's get started, Andrew. So we've got a question here. Lots of people think about sustainability as risk management rather than value creation. How do you change their minds?
Yeah, I mean, look, as I talked about at the beginning, there's a number of buckets of value that we create, and I think companies are seeing that more and more. The risk discussion is really interesting because it did start there, and most companies saw it as a compliance issue, and it was really just about avoiding regulation. Um, and in a way, we're back to risk as a value creation bucket, but in a much bigger way, in a systemic risk. The systemic risk to your supply chain, to the business itself, to staying relevant. And for insurance companies or banks, it's just to their whole portfolios or to say whole cities. But the number of companies that are seeing value from that top line is very large. I mean, the growth engines in many sectors, like say food and consumer products, the fastest growing companies are almost all focused in some way on sustainability. They're providing some quality of life or quality of product to consumers. And so you're seeing like the big guys in those sectors buying up these purpose-led, sustainability-focused businesses. So I don't think there's as much debate about that. I think it's pretty easy to prove.
Great. Another question here. A lot of your examples are about big companies. Obviously, Halma is a group of smaller companies, some only 25 employees. So how would you advise them to approach sustainability?
Yeah, I think the ways that companies create value aren't that different, right? I mean, small companies have modeled themselves and looked at large companies for years. I mean, the idea of we can cut costs, we can reduce our own risk, we can connect with our customers and employees better. That's all true. I think there's a couple key differences. Obviously, the pressure that you can put on suppliers as a small business is really probably the biggest gap with what large companies can do. But as B2B businesses, frankly, I mean, Halma businesses are more on the receiving end of that pressure. And so that doesn't matter what size they are. They'll get the same requests as the large companies and even medium start expanding who they're asking their suppliers questions. They start with the biggest, right? We'll do our top 100 suppliers, and then they bring it out to 20,000, 30,000. They end up asking questions of everybody. So the pressure will come. I think where the small and medium businesses have the advantage, frankly, is in two things. First, family owned or kind of longer term focused businesses are often in the smaller scale, right? They can think longer term and think in a smarter way about where they're making their investments and when the payback is. And then most importantly, most of the innovation comes from smaller businesses. It always has. As I said, in some sectors, they're getting bought up. But the examples I can give you of companies that have found innovative ways to reduce their footprint, often they're leveraging and buying or helping scale up a smaller company's innovation. That's just been true, forever. So I think the opportunity here is for the smaller companies to step back and think very heretically, as I said, about how things work and why they have to work a certain way, and they often can go in a new direction.
That's brilliant. We've got a question here. What are the typical KPIs companies use to measure positive impact?
Yeah, look, it's a really good question. I think one of the things we're going to work on now that the book's out and we're saying here's the strategy, here's how you build this kind of company, is to try to build the right toolkit for KPIs. There's a lot of work out there. There's a lot of people I know who their lives are metrics around ESG issues. It's a little bit of the Wild West out there right now in terms of how do you measure broadly as a company more sustainable. The banks are all looking at ESG ratings now, the investors, and they're all over the map. I mean, there's some obvious things like literally what's your carbon footprint and what's the direction of it. Real basic volume stuff on water use, waste use, carbon, and then some social stuff. There's more and more quantitative measuring now than there used to be, and actual quantitative goals that companies set around social dimensions, like the percentage of management that are minority or women, gender parity in pay, living wages in the supply chain. So there's a series of things that you can measure. One of the things I'd recommend if you're interested in kind of what are the key questions or the areas we need to look at, on the website for the book, netpositive.world, we have a short readiness assessment. It's 25 questions to kind of step back and say, how much do we really know? And do we have the foundational information and data that we need? And are we asking ourselves the right questions? And I'd start there.
We've got a really interesting question here about the US labor market. So thinking about DEI, obviously, as a facet of sustainability, people are calling it the Great Resignation currently in the US labor market. How do you think a focus on sustainability can help solve for this?
Look, I'll be honest, I've talked about this with a lot of people, and I'm gonna ask some like serious economist friends, that kind of global level economists about this, because I don't actually understand what's going on. I don't think almost anybody does. There's a question, frankly, where is everyone? There was concern for months that there were people sitting out the labor market because they were getting so much unemployment. I always thought that was a little bit exaggerated. It wasn't that much money, but that ended months ago. There's still some laws that might be protecting people, like you can't evict someone right now because of COVID, but I don't think that's all of it either. I think we're in one of those grand transitions that happens. I found my path into this career after the dot-com crash in 2000. I was in a small startup and we went under and I was unemployed. And I think there's something seriously happening with people stepping back and going, what do I really care about? They're watching loved ones get sick and die, and it's making them ask something different. So I do believe that this desire for meaning in work is clearly accelerating, that people want to go to someplace they share their values with and believe it's worth putting their time in. I mean, I remind people all the time that if you're a millennial or younger, you've come into the world or come into the work world in an era where there's no job guarantees, basically. My father worked at IBM for 35 years. And starting around when I came into the workforce, they started laying people off for the first time in their history. And layoffs in the 90s, 2000s, that was a big way for companies to profit. So these people, the younger people, have zero guarantee from companies. There's no pensions. So they're going to go where their values are met. And so I think that's the kind of theoretical version. I think very specifically, wages are going to rise and have been rising at the lower end, at the living wage level, and more people will come into the market when there's higher wages. And again, people get lost in this discussion like it's going to cost business more, but more people having money in their pocket, a bottom up or a middle out economics is actually far more profitable for the economy than trying to keep wages really low and keep profits up at the corporate and very rich level.
Okay, that's brilliant. We've got a question here from Marco Placidi, who says, not all sustainability is created equal. How do we focus on the initiatives that actually do make a difference?
Well, it comes back to the metrics question. And I think, look, I think you got to go with the biggest problems. I think everything climate related is the fundamental question of our era. It really is. So there's kind of a hierarchy of priorities on this. I think there's the easy wins, as I talked about, that are going to have the highest ROI, the stuff that's just sitting there. And I say this from experience. I have a large a client, a consumer product client, and there's a lot of companies have not done a lot on this yet, and there's still so much savings sitting there. And they did an audit of one of their factories and found 17% energy savings in a day. 5% of their entire energy bill was a transformer that didn't need to be on, that had been on for years. There's things like that everywhere. So there's kind of find the easy wins, put some energy meters, just ask employees to go find stuff. But then there's the larger, kind of longer conversations of shifting to renewable energy, of having better conversations with your suppliers and maybe your logistics partners on distribution and how to reduce the footprint. I mean, there's kind of the focus on the basics. And then the social side is always hard to measure, but I think you talk to your employees and you reach out to your stakeholders and your customers and find out what they expect of you and how you can improve your footprint to them, in whatever way that means, how you can improve your service to them and provide them a way to make their business or their lives more sustainable.
And just a quick final question. A lot of our companies say that they solve these problems already and they don't create them. Is that enough?
Yeah, I mean, look, there's no company that can claim to be all positive or all negative, right? And companies are not monolithic, they're not one thing. Um, and yes, I mean, a company that's improving safety, like a lot of yours are, improving health, producing renewable energy, they're all on the positive side of the ledger, but there's still impacts, right? I mean, producing renewable energy requires making panels or making wind turbines, and there's a footprint to that, and there's an end of life question about those products. They're sitting basically, wind turbines are basically just getting buried right now. So you have the companies that make composites working hard to figure out, okay, how do we recycle those? What do we do with those? So there's always more to do, right? There's always more to make the business actually positive because there's going to be ripples and impacts no matter what you do. And I think even if you believe that you're selling something that really is kind of fully positive, there's the question of the people in your business, the employees, their lives and well-being, the communities you operate in. There's always kind of more to say. How can we have an even more positive impact and bring, if we are having a positive impact, bring that to others so it can scale, right? Bring that to our peers, even competitors, if it's not proprietary. Really, you're seeing that more and more in companies. They're sharing best practices on water management, say in a region, across competitors, across sectors. See how you can scale up whatever it is you're doing that has a positive impact.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much, Andrew. Unfortunately, we're out of time now. I'm sure we could have gone on much, much longer, but thank you so much for your talk and for your Q&A.